Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World, where we're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. In 1985, I started a new job, and my best friend was a guy named Rob, who worked with me at Ithaca College. 9 times out of 10, when we'd get in his Honda Civic, he'd turn the key, and Elvis Costello's 1977 debut, My Aim Is True, would come blasting out of the speakers. I'd already started the slide into my jazz coma, so I didn't know this bespectacled indie rock star. I was immediately taken with the quirky vocal delivery and the ray gun tremolo work. To a couple of young musicians in glasses and average haircuts, Costello, wielding his Jazzmaster, was a ray of hope. Fender did set out to build a range-topping jazz guitar when they began design work on the Jazzmaster in 1957. Instead, it found a home in the hands of musicians reimagining the music of their time. If you're here because you dig Jazzmasters, its players, or like me, you're just plain curious, sit back and enjoy the alternative ride, because this is the 5 Watt World short history of the Fender Jazzmaster. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And if you've already subscribed, swing by the store, grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. There's a link in the description. Though Fender had captured the attention of country, blues, and R&B players early in the 50s with their Telecaster and Stratocaster guitars, jazz was still a huge market, and Fender hadn't been able to sway many traditional jazzers away from their hollow body guitars. For context, the Fender company had been around a decade before rock and roll kicked in. Despite rock and roll's start in the mid-50s, Leo Fender and sales director Don Randall were focused very much on Western swing and dance bands that were big in Southern California. Fender was doing well in '57 on the strength of the Telecaster, precision bass, tweed amplifiers, and the recently tweaked Stratocaster. But by the late 50s, rock and roll was in a bad place in the States. Buddy Holly was killed in a plane crash. Chuck Berry was in jail. Elvis Presley was drafted into the Army. Little Richard had found religion, and Jerry Lee Lewis had gone down in scandal. The radio was full of overproduced, oversweetened teen pop derivatives, and the press was acting as if rock was over before it really even began. So Fender had little interest in betting big on a genre in such precarious position. Instead, Fender would look to jazz guitarists with their newest creation to broaden sales. They wanted to expand and enrich their reputation beyond solely appealing to young players. They were looking to build a top-tier instrument for top-tier musicians. Fender imagined the Jazzmaster as their new top-of-the-line instrument, a Cadillac in the age where Cadillac was actually a Cadillac, on the back of those working-class Tellys and Strats. But despite the famous photo of Joe Pass playing a Jazzmaster, the guitar never caught on with its intended audience. The guitar can produce traditional jazzy tones, almost to the detriment of having a wider range of tones on tap. But Leo had wavered from the way he developed the Telly and the Strat. He was famous for working directly with players on the early guitars and basses, often showing up at gigs and thrusting the instruments into players' hands on the bandstand. I've read that as he neared completion of a prototype, he'd typically have spent as much as 50% of his time traveling out to venues to get musicians' input. There's no such stories floating around about the Jazzmaster. Leo is a masterful engineer, and like most great innovators, he listened to those for which he was innovating. And this led to repeated success despite not playing guitar himself. But he did far less of this, it seems, during the development of the Jazzmaster. Jazz guitar was a world away, centered on the East Coast mainly at the time, and was the domain of hollow-body archtop guitars and Ampeg amplifiers. Fender wanted to take a bite out of the market share that Gibson seemed to own, and so they designed a more affordable, modern, solid-body electric guitar that they hoped would nudge out the expensive and more fragile hollow-body instruments. They wanted to put their guitars in front of audiences in the hands of guys like Herb Ellis, Jim Hall, and Barney Kessel. Fender's hopes of reaching the jazz market failed. Today, it seems understandable, inevitable even. Jazz players just weren't looking for a new style of guitar, so the boys from Southern California could innovate all day long, but they just were trying to answer a question the jazz guys hadn't asked. The Jazzmaster was a departure in many ways from previous Fender guitars. It had some Fender family traits, but it didn't look an awful lot like a Stratocaster, and it didn't look anything like the venerable Telecaster. Stretched and contoured, and the design ideas started with the Stratocasters. Its ash or alder body was longer and heavier because of the increased size. The offset waist was specifically designed to make the guitar balanced while seated, as jazz guys often were. We'd see this design element again in the jazz bass 2 years later. The Jazzmaster's horns were less pronounced, and the pickguard was correspondingly more angular than the gentle curves of a Stratocaster. The 2 large rectangular pickups and an abundance of controls contributed to its atomic age look, and it fit right in with the tail fins on all the new Chevys rolling down the strip at the time. Leo told guitar historian Tom Wheeler, "That was another thing that just made sense. Normally, the player is forced to hold a guitar at an angle to play it, because it's not balanced. So it was a matter of fitting it to the rib cage, a matter of function. The design certainly worked for seated playing, but outside of recording studios, the Jazzmasters were not likely to be played that way. At the urging of Don Randall and the Fender sales and marketing staff, the Jazzmaster was the first Fender guitar with a rosewood fingerboard instead of maple. This was seen as a deluxe feature and was a bid to give the new guitar appointments that would go head-to-head with Gibson's rosewood boards. A slab of rosewood with a 7 1/4 inch radius was glued to the face of a maple neck. It was the standard Fender 25 1/2 inch scale length. A truss rod ran through a channel under the fingerboard, negating the need for the skunk stripe on the back of the neck. Dot position markers were made of an off-white clay material and had a redesigned headstock, similar to the Strat, but slightly more flared at the bottom. The guitar had 2 newly designed pickups, wide coils that set out to provide a less bright tone than folks were used to from Fender guitars. Leo said of the pickup design, the pickup wasn't so deep, and it was wider, thinner, more spaced out. See, the more spaced out the coil is, the wider the spectrum under the string, the warmer the tone. The neck and bridge pickup are reverse wound, so they provide hum canceling in the middle position. It succeeds in giving the Jazzmaster a tone that's different from a Strat or a Tele. One of the Jazzmaster's most notable features is the pickup circuit, which was based on an idea that Fender manufacturing manager Forrest White had back in 1951. It features 2 unusual roller thumb wheel controls and a slide switch on the pickguard above the strings. The slide switch selects between 2 different pickup circuits, the lead and rhythm circuits. When the switch is in the lead position, the guitar's tone is controlled by the conventional tone and volume knobs and the pickup selector switch below the strings. When it's in the rhythm position, it selects the neck pickup only, with the brightness rolled off slightly due to different values of the potentiometers, 50K versus 1 meg in the lead circuit, and the volume and tone are controlled by the 2 roller wheels. The other controls are bypassed. The intention was that this circuit would allow the performer to quickly switch to a preset volume and tone setting for rhythm playing. The lead circuit pot values also stray from Fender's usual spec. Up until the introduction of the Jazzmaster, Fender had used 250K pots on all of their guitars. The Jazzmaster's lead circuit uses a 1 meg pot. Leo had also developed a new tremolo, working completely differently than the trem on a Strat. It had a single spring housed under a large flat tailpiece. The strings passed over a separate floating bridge that rocked on its mounts as the arm was moved up and down. The system provides a more subtle action than the Strat's tremolo, and it was hoped better to match the subtleties of the intended style of music. Unfortunately, this design would end up with problems later on. Leo had designed the new trem for use with string gauges of 12 or bigger. These gauges were common at the time, but by the early 60s, many players had started to use lighter gauge strings. Players were looking for strings that were easier to bend and began fitting mixed sets of guitar and banjo strings to get the lighter gauges they were looking for. By the mid-60s, Ernie Ball had begun selling customized sets, and many players had started using them. The lighter string had much less tension on the system and created tuning stability issues. Additionally, when the lighter strings were used on Jazzmasters, the strings would often pop out of the bridge saddles when picked too heavily. This was mostly due to the shallow string angle that the Jazzmaster strings have as they pass over the bridge from the tailpiece. Many years later, this was addressed by the well-known custom bridges like those made by Mastery. Though it didn't sell to jazzers, Fender managed to sell some Jazzmasters anyway. Perhaps young players who might have seen Luther Perkins from Johnny Cash's band bought Jazzmasters. Don Randall ran the sales and marketing arm of Fender, and he brought in Bob Perrine of the Perrine Jacoby ad agency in 1957. They would continue to shape Fender's advertising and hence their image until 1969. Jazzmasters were heavily featured in Fender's late 50s ad campaign, "You Won't Part With Yours Either." The ad campaign showed Fender guitars draped around the necks of skydivers and tank drivers, and this was also Perrine's idea. Randall also took control of the Fender catalog and produced the first full color book in 58-59, and they made an especially big deal of the custom color options. And then, in 1960, the Jazzmaster was heard on the hit single Walk Don't Run. It was the first of the surf songs to break into the Billboard Hot 100, and it peaked at number 2 that summer. It turns out that the Ventures hit version was a cover, inspired by a Chet Atkins recording of the same song. But Chet was covering the original written and recorded by jazz guitarist Johnny Smith in 1954. Smith had actually written the tune over the chord changes to Softly as in a Morning Sunrise, a jazz standard since its release in an operetta in 1928 written by Oscar Hammerstein and Sigmund Romberg. I love the irony that the first big Jazzmaster hit was by a surf band covering a jazz tune. But I digress. Based out of Seattle, the Ventures were endorsed by Fender and used a precision bass, Stratocaster, and Jazzmaster. Don Wilson's instrument of choice was the Jazzmaster, and he was seen playing it everywhere. Of course, the Ventures went on to famously use Moss-Wright instruments later on, but Wilson has continued to use his Jazzmaster, touring with the band to the present day. Of course, this influenced many young people to not only want to learn to play guitar, but want to learn to play on a Jazzmaster. This first big hit of the surf music scene would lead many to emulate Wilson and the Ventures in the wake of their success. And that's how the Jazzmaster came to be seen as the surf guitar. It wasn't in the smoky clubs of New York or Philadelphia where it found its home, but rather in the reverb-soaked instrumentals blasting out of the radios on beaches and in cars everywhere. Soon young players would hear Wayne Moss twang away on a Jazzmaster on Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman. And gospel and soul bandleader Pop Staples used a Jazzmaster in the 60s and 70s for recordings with the Staples Singers, which had a Stratocaster pickup added between the stock pickups. The guitar first appeared in ads during the summer of 1958. In those ads, it showed a rosewood fingerboard, but unlike the later production model, the old walnut plug is still visible in that prototype. The guitar was on the July price list just in time for the summer trade shows. It listed a Jazzmaster with tremolo and dual pickups for $329.50. And interestingly, a non-tremolo version for $299.50. This last remains a bit of a mystery in Fender history, as a prototype of the non-tremolo Jazzmaster has never surfaced, and of course, none were produced or sold. There was also a maple prototype built with a desert sand, blonde body, black pickguard and pickup covers, and Tele-style dome knobs. Production guitars began to ship in the fall of '58. They had gold anodized aluminum pickguards like you'd see on Precision Basses, Music Masters, or Duosonics of the era, and the new three-tone sunburst finish with black, then red fading to a yellow in the center. The earliest runs used a red paint that was susceptible to fading with exposure to the sunlight, so over time, these earliest guitars often faded into almost two-tone bursts. There was a long plastic-tipped trem arm and a Strat-style control knobs, and a chrome bridge cover completed the look. Blonde finishes and other custom colors with gold guards were available as a special order, but very few were made. In early '59, Fender moved to a nitrate plastic pickguard on the Jazzmaster. 4 layers with imitation tortoiseshell on top and a sandwich of white, black, white underneath from then until 1965. To help with shielding, a thin sheet of aluminum was shaped to fit the control cavity under the pickguard. The three-tone sunburst would be the standard finish on the Jazzmaster until the mid-'70s. But early in the 60s, custom color orders had become increasingly popular. In July 1961, Fender Sales finally issued their first official custom color chart, showing 14 custom colors and mentioning blonde. Any of the 15 colors could be ordered for a 5% upcharge. Black, Olympic white, shoreline gold, Inca silver, surf green, foam green, Sonic, Daphne, or Lake Placid blue, metallic Sherwood green, Fiesta and Dakota red, and the deep pink metallic known as burgundy mist. Rarest of all was shell pink, technically also a DuPont Cadillac color, but one Cadillac never officially painted on any vehicles at the time, and it would quickly be replaced in the custom chart by candy apple red, which would be one of Fender's longest-lasting color options. The specifics of custom color finishes at Fender, the base coats and what was sprayed over them, would be a book or a video unto itself. But likely, it's enough to say here that custom colors became much more popular at the time of the Jazzmaster, and the variety of original custom color Golden Era Jazzmasters is a dizzying rainbow of cool. Of course, by the end of '59, all the Fender instruments in the line had moved to rosewood fingerboards. Conferring with my friend and Vintage Guitar Magazine columnist Zach Childs of Ask Zach fame, confirmed that 1962 saw the completion of a transition from the slab boards to the curved or laminate boards. Leo believed that this construction method would help counteract the differences in expansion and contraction of the rosewood versus maple of the neck, which had been a problem on some of the slab board necks. Also in '62, Fender moved to an ink stamp date on the heel of the neck. By mid-'63, they'd gone to an even thinner curve of rosewood, and this style of construction lasted into the '70s. Some notable players used Jazzmasters in the '60s. Clapton used one briefly in the Yardbirds. Both Pete Townsend and Bob Dylan were captured with Jazzmasters, and Jimi Hendrix used one before and after the experience in 1966. 1965 saw binding added to the fingerboard, and the clay dot markers were changed to perloid. It's worth noting here that Jazzmaster necks are basically identical to Stratocaster necks. When Eric Johnson asked Fender to use binding on the rosewood version of his signature Strat, it was because he had seen a few examples where Stratocasters had left the factory with necks intended for Jazzmasters. In '66, the perloid dots changed to perloid block inlays. '65 would also see the beginning of the Transition logo, and by '67 it had been replaced by the black CBS logo with Fender Jazzmaster in large, bold lettering. The original headstock design lasted until '67 as well. In mid-'67, the headstock was changed to the new larger headstock, being used on the Stratocaster at that time. From '58 to '67, the finish was nitrocellulose, and the finish was switched to polyester in '68. Always curious about the details, I double-checked with Dave Honorato at Dojo Guitar Repair, who confirmed for me that it was also in '68 that the insulation on the wiring went from cloth to plastic. During the CBS years, the earlier 1- and 2-piece ash or alder bodies were replaced with 3- and 4-piece bodies. Confusingly, the Jazzmaster was somehow spared the change to the 3-bolt neck plate in the '70s that we saw on Strats and Tellys. After all these changes, the model then stayed basically the same until it was discontinued. Fender kept the Jazzmaster in their lineup well beyond the height of the surf music craze in the mid-'60s. But the early '70s really belonged to the sound of humbucking pickups, and Fender followed along, putting their wide-range pickups in the Tele Thinline and Deluxe models. In a sketch that might represent the music at that time, the Jazzmaster would be tucked into a distant back corner. And this is why, when the new wave artists of the late '70s turned their back on the excesses and tools of the mainstream rock world, they found bargain basement Jazzmasters readily available and worthy tools. Television's Tom Verlaine in New York and Elvis Costello in the UK resurrected the model and injected an anti-cool into the Jazzmaster. But the sales of used Jazzmasters weren't lining the pockets at CBS-led Fender in the '70s, so right when its underground cred was growing, it was discontinued, 22 years after its introduction in 1980. By 1985, CBS had sold Fender, and Fender Japan reintroduced the Jazzmaster in 1986 as a vintage-style reissue based on the 1962 version of the guitar. They also made a '66 reissue version with binding and block inlays, but with the older-style smaller headstock. Those guitars were produced in Japan until 1999. It's worth noting that the Fender Japan Jazzmasters are sometimes criticized for not having correct style pickups. Under the wide covers, there are narrower Strat-style pickups, and it's said that they don't have the traditional Jazzmaster tone. Still, the made in Japan, or as the next states, crafted in Japan, offset guitars are very well made, and besides, guitarists are often find themselves swapping up pickups for any style of guitar. Jazzmasters were out of production by Fender US from 1980 until 1999. In '99, the American Vintage Series Jazzmaster was introduced, also based on the '62 model. The early '80s would see Rick Ocasek fronting the cars with his custom Jazzmaster refinished in bright pink. One of the greatest modern torchbearers of the Jazzmaster was My Bloody Valentine's Kevin Shields. 1991's album Loveless catapulted them to the top of the music industry for the short period of time between the death of hair metal and the ascendancy of grunge. Known for ear-bleeding volume levels and pioneering uses of reverse delay, Kevin is best known for using a 1964 Jazzmaster, owned, to this day, by his friend Bill Carey, and a 1959 Refin he later purchased to create the subtle glide pitch effect. I became aware of Swerve Driver through my buddy Rick Beato constantly wearing a hoodie he got at a reunion show. Adam Franklin and Company emerged with a heavier rock sound than their shoegaze contemporaries. They would evolve over the next few years to include elements of psychedelia, classic pop, and indie rock. Shoegaze, spearheaded by My Bloody Valentine, would last only a few years, with its popularity mostly centered in the UK. But were it not for the sudden dramatic shift in the entire music industry, we could be living in a world where shoegaze was as important to the 90s as metal had been in the 80s, and excessive pop was to the 70s. In 2007, Fender did a Jazzmaster as part of their thin-skinned series, with a thinner vintage nitro finish. The thin-skin guitars had many period-correct details, but were offered with 9.5-inch radius boards instead of the original 7.25. When the American Vintage Series was revamped in 2012, the 62 style JM was replaced with a 65 model equipped with a bound neck. Signature model Jazzmasters include J. Mascis from Dinosaur Jr. After the Fender American version was discontinued, Squier released a J. Mascis Signature with similar specs that's still in production. In April 2008, Fender issued a Corona-built Elvis Costello Jazzmaster. It was a faithful replica of his 1960s-era guitar that he'd used on his debut album, My Aim Is True. It has the stripped walnut-stained body of the original and a modified tremolo that would float to produce Costello's trademark spy movie sound. June 2008 saw the release of signatures from the guys from Sonic Youth, Lee Ronaldo and Thurston Moore. Heavily modified from the original Jazzmaster spec, they were built the way Ronaldo and Moore used them. Winter NAMM 2014 saw the release of the Jim Root Signature Jazzmaster, based on the preferences of the Slipknot and Stone Sour guitarist. Though it has the shape of a Jazzmaster, it has very little else in common with its ancestor. It has high-output EMG 60 and 81 humbucking pickups, a satin black mahogany body, a single volume control, and a three-way switch. It's finished off with a Strat-style, hardtail, non-vibrato string through the body bridge. At the same NAMM show, Fender released the Troy Van Leeuwen signature guitar in honor of the Queen of the Stone Age guitarist. Based on a late 60s guitar with block inlays and bound fingerboard, it sports a unique gloss oxblood finish with matching headstock, a Mustang-style bridge, and witch hat-style control knobs. Newer to the scene, Seratone's guitarist and vocalist A.J. Haynes jumped out at me from the pages of a recent Guitar Player magazine with the simple statement, "I love my Fender Jazzmaster." I've been checking out their gospel meets garage band stuff ever since. And it seems fitting to wrap up with Wilco lead and jazz avant-garde guitarist Nels Cline. Influenced by Sonic Youth, he started with a Jaguar and immediately fell in love with the shape. But the extra string length and meat of the Jazzmaster tone were the big sale. Shortly afterwards, he was using them for both rock and jazz gigs. His main Jazzmaster is from 1959, and it was only by playing other Jazzmasters that he's realized what an exceptional instrument it is. Has a deeply scarred black refinish, worn through in many places, including behind the mastery bridge where he often plays. And interestingly, he uses GHS 12-gauge strings, a gauge that fits Leo's original design for the tremolo back when 12s were considered lights. I love how one of our current champions of the Jazzmaster is actually a jazzer who's equally comfortable on a rock or Americana gig, just like the Jazzmaster itself. If I missed something and you have your own Jazzmaster story to share, please put it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. I'd like to thank Zach Childs of the Ask Zach YouTube channel for the depth of his Fender nerdiness that benefits us all. If you aren't already subscribed to Ask Zach, you should do that right now. As always, I am indebted to my friends and fellow guitar nerds Perry McManus and Dave Honorato for their contributions and edits. The 5-watt world wouldn't be the same without them. This video would not have been possible without Tony Bacon's excellent The Fender Electric Guitar Book and the book Fender, The Golden Age, 1946 to 1970 by Kelly, Foster, and Kelly. There are links to the books in the description. If you enjoyed this short history of the Jazzmaster, hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Remember to click the bell icon to be notified when we put out a new video. And if you want to see more of these videos, stop by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5-watt world.